welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber CRISC Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. Managing third-party risk does not stop once the contract is signed. In other words, risk continues even after expectations are documented. The contract defines service terms, data obligations, and performance commitments, but it does not ensure those promises are kept. In other words, paper does not equal action. Third-party risk is dynamic. In other words, the threat landscape, services, and compliance expectations can all change over time. Managing third-party risk means treating vendors like internal systems, except with less direct control. In other words, you must apply governance even though the entity is external. Effective management requires continuous monitoring, governance, and responsiveness to emerging issues. In other words, ongoing attention prevents risk from going unnoticed. On the exam, watch for clues like the contract was in place, but risk was unmonitored. This signals that management processes failed after agreement. In other words, responsibility does not end with signature. Someone inside the organization must be clearly assigned to oversee each third-party relationship. In other words, responsibility stays internal. This internal stakeholder may come from the vendor management office, risk team, or compliance department. In other words, the person must have authority and access. Their duties include coordinating risk assessments, tracking vendor performance, and maintaining communication across business functions. In other words, they connect all the moving parts. Business units must stay engaged as well. In other words, you cannot fully outsource oversight within your own company. The risk register must include third-party risks with clearly documented owners. In other words, accountability must be recorded. On the exam, remember that vendor risk is always the organization's responsibility. In other words, it is never owned by the vendor. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Not all vendors carry the same risk, so segmentation is critical. In other words, you must group vendors by risk level. This involves assessing their importance to operations, access to sensitive data, and how they impact regulatory compliance. In other words, rank them based on what could go wrong. Use this segmentation to apply different levels of oversight. In other words, spend more effort on the riskiest vendors. This allows resources to be focused where they are needed most and helps avoid fatigue from over-monitoring low-risk vendors. In other words, it is more efficient and effective. On the exam, watch for clues like all vendors were treated equally. This signals a failure in segmentation. In other words, uniform treatment creates blind spots. Monitoring activities should be tailored to vendor tier and risk profile. In other words, higher risk vendors require deeper scrutiny. Track performance against service level agreements and key risk indicators such as uptime and incident rates. In other words, check whether they are delivering as promised. Review their compliance reports regularly, including SOC 2 audits and penetration testing results. In other words, validate their internal controls. Request annual questionnaires or self-assessments to capture changes in process or risk posture. In other words, update your understanding of their environment. For the highest risk vendors, conduct audits or independent testing. In other words, go beyond documents and verify in practice. Use continuous monitoring platforms to observe real-time data, such as cybersecurity ratings or threat alerts. In other words, use technology to stay ahead of issues. Reporting is how third-party risk becomes visible across the organization. In other words, tracking without communication is ineffective. Use dashboards and risk scorecards to show exposure and trends. In other words, present data in a clear and visual way. Flag problems, such as overdue patching, repeated SLA violations, or policy gaps. In other words, highlight where attention is needed. Reports should not just list issues, they should include what actions are being taken and who is responsible. In other words, they should lead to decisions. Governance committees should regularly review vendor risk reports to assess whether escalation or changes are needed. In other words, oversight is not optional. On the exam, look for answers that emphasize presenting risk in ways that lead to meaningful action. When a risk indicator crosses a defined threshold, a response is required. In other words, triggers must lead to action. Examples include missing a service level agreement, failing a control test, or having a security incident. In other words, these events signal that the vendor is out of bounds. The response process includes notifying internal teams, investigating if needed, and applying contract terms. In other words, act according to plan. Residual risk must also be reassessed, and treatment strategies may need to be updated. In other words, confirm whether the problem changed your overall exposure. The entire process must be documented for auditability. In other words, written records are required. On the exam, a delay in response usually signals a breakdown in monitoring. In other words, timeliness is part of effectiveness. Monitoring depends on indicators that reflect vendor behavior. In other words, what you measure is what you manage. Key risk indicators may include late deliverables, service downtime, or incidents. In other words, signs of failure to meet obligations. Key control indicators could involve security scan results, failed login attempts, or expired certificates. In other words, signs that controls are weakening. Compliance indicators include audit results, failed policy checks, or missing documentation. In other words, signs of non-conformance with requirements. Monitor these indicators at intervals that match the vendor's risk tier. In other words, riskier vendors require more frequent review. Choose the indicators that make sense for the type and level of risk involved. In other words, tailor your monitoring to the exposure. Vendor risk management tools streamline oversight activities. In other words, they reduce manual tracking. Governance, risk, and compliance platforms can automate surveys, flag overdue reviews, and centralize documentation. In other words, they save time and improve accuracy. These tools can integrate with third-party security ratings providers to track real-time posture. In other words, outside data enhances internal awareness. Alerts can be configured to signal changes in vendor status or missed deadlines. In other words, automation helps prevent surprises. Workflows can also be managed through these platforms, including escalations and reporting. In other words, the system supports response, not just tracking. On the exam, if a scenario says manual tracking led to missed reviews, the correct answer likely involves automation. In other words, technology is a solution to human error. A strong third-party risk program must improve over time. In other words, it should evolve and scale. Update the criteria used to classify and rate vendor risks as new threats and technologies emerge. In other words, stay aligned with current conditions. Track metrics like reduction in incidents, improved response times, or more efficient onboarding. In other words, measure the program's success. Simplify and speed up processes that were previously manual or inconsistent. In other words, look for ways to remove delays and errors. Ensure that procurement, legal, IT, and risk teams work together. In other words, success comes from collaboration. On the exam, pick answers that reflect maturity, governance alignment, and operational consistency. In other words, favor structured and integrated programs. CRISC exam questions about vendor risk monitoring focus on visibility, accountability, and response. In other words, they test how well oversight is maintained. If a scenario says the vendor was not reassessed for 2 years, it shows a monitoring failure. In other words, periodic review was missing. If asked which metric detects a control breakdown, look for a key control indicator or a trend in SLA violations. In other words, evidence that something is degrading. If a vendor fails an audit, you should reassess the risk, escalate appropriately, and apply the contract response terms. In other words, act with structure. If asked who should monitor the vendor, it should be the assigned internal owner. In other words, external parties never hold internal accountability. Correct answers will show that third-party oversight is built into organizational processes, not left to chance. In other words, strong monitoring comes from structure, not assumption. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cybersecurity Risk Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.